Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be looking at Ben Shapiro's book, The Authoritarian Moment, How the Left Weaponized America's Institutions Against Dissent.
Oh, interesting title.
Yeah, I know, right? Just that title alone. Does that make you think that this book is going to focus on just one side of the political spectrum or both?
Just from the title, I'd say it sounds like a pretty pointed critique.
Mm,
But we'll see how Shapiro backs up the weaponization claim. It'll be interesting to see how he presents his argument.
I think that's a good point. Before we even start going into the book itself, I think maybe it'd be helpful to give a little bit of context about who Ben Shapiro is.
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful. Ben Shapiro is a pretty prominent figure in conservative media these days.
Right. He's a conservative political commentator. He's a best-selling author, and he's also the founder of the Daily Wire, which is a popular conservative media company.
Yeah, and I mean, he's known for his fast-talking, debating style. He really doesn't shy away from controversial topics, so it's safe to say we can expect some strong opinions in this book.
Yeah, definitely. So, okay, let's just jump into the deep end here. What is the main argument that Shapiro's laying out in The Authoritarian Moment?
Well, at its core, Shapiro argues that the biggest threat to democracy in America today is something he calls ochlocracy, which is,
Holacracy.
yeah, it's not a word you hear every day.
I've never even heard that word before.
It essentially means mob rule. So
Mm.
his argument is that when a mob, any mob, gains enough power, it can start to trample individual rights and freedoms, even in a, supposedly democratic society.
So he's saying that democracy is vulnerable to being kind of hijacked no matter who is in charge?
Exactly. And while he does acknowledge that both the left and the right are susceptible to this, his book primarily focuses on what he sees as the left's slide toward this mob mentality. And he actually uses a historical example to set the stage for his argument, Weimar Germany.
The period between the two world wars, when Germany was trying to establish a democratic government after World War I. And, well, it didn't end well, did it?
Not at all. Weimar Germany was ultimately destroyed by extremism on both ends of the political spectrum. So Shapiro uses this historical parallel to show how both communist and Nazi brutality, ultimately led to the downfall of German democracy.
So he's drawing a connection between the chaos and violence of that era and what he sees as potentially happening in America today.
Yes. And to help understand how that potential for tyranny manifests, he introduces two concepts, utopian brutality and reactionary brutality.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but I'm also a little confused. Can you break those down for me? What does he mean by those terms?
Sure. So in Shapiro's view, utopian brutality is essentially a left-wing phenomenon. He says it describes this tendency to push for really radical social change, even though it means using force or silencing opposing voices to achieve it.
So it's like you're so focused on achieving this, like, perfect society, this utopia, that you become brutal in the process of trying to get there.
Exactly. And he contrasts this with what he calls reactionary brutality, which he sees as more of a right-wing phenomenon. And this is when people react, often violently, to perceived threats to the existing social order.
So using his framework, you could say that utopian brutality is driven by a desire to kind of create a new future, whereas reactionary brutality is driven by fear of losing the past or the way things are.
I think that's a good way to put it, yeah. And Shapiro believes that both of these forms of brutality, both utopian and reactionary, can be equally destructive to a functioning democracy. And to, try and measure these authoritarian tendencies, he brings up the concept of something called the right-wing authoritarianism, or RWA scale, and the left-wing authoritarianism, or LWA scale.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying there's like a test you can take to figure out how authoritarian you are?
No, not exactly. These scales were developed by social psychologists, and they try to identify these personality traits that are commonly associated with authoritarian leanings. So, for example, the RWA scale, it measures things like a strong desire for order and conformity, aggression toward those who are different, and blind obedience to authority figures.
Okay, so I can see how that would make sense. Someone who scores high on that scale might be more likely to follow as, strongman leader. They might discriminate against minorities. They might resist any kind of social change.
Exactly. Now, the LWA scale, that's a newer concept. It focuses on traits like a desire for ideological purity, a willingness to use coercion to impose one's values on others, and intolerance of any opposing viewpoints.
So he's arguing that this form of authoritarianism is maybe more dangerous because it's often disguised as a fight for equality and justice.
That's a key part of his argument, yeah. And he believes that this form of authoritarianism, this left-wing authoritarianism, is rampant within several key American institutions.
And this is where his claim of weaponization comes into play, right? He's
Yes.
saying these institutions are being used to silence dissent and push a very specific ideological agenda.
Precisely. Shapiro argues that American institutions, specifically universities, the media, corporations, Hollywood, and social media, have been effectively weaponized by the authoritarian left to silence any dissent.
Wow. That's a pretty bold statement. He's basically saying that the core structures of American society are being used to undermine American values.
Yeah, and he dedicates a significant portion of the book to providing examples of what he sees as evidence of this trend playing out. He examines each of those institutions in detail and highlights specific incidents, policies, and cultural shifts that he believes support his claims.
Okay, so let's unpack these institutions one by one. Let's start with universities, the hallowed halls of academia. They're supposed to be these bastions of free speech, of the free exchange of ideas. So how does Shapiro claim that universities have become authoritarian?
So Shapiro's argument is that what began as a genuine push for, greater inclusivity and social justice on campuses has, in his view, morphed into something much more sinister.
Okay.
He believes that this push for inclusivity has gone too far, and it's transformed into this rigid ideological conformity where dissenting voices are silenced and conservative viewpoints are essentially ostracized.
So he's saying that the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction, and now universities are actually stifling free speech in the name of political correctness.
Exactly. And he even points to, the 1964 Berkeley free speech movement as an example of how activism, even when well-intentioned, can backfire and lead to the suppression of opposing viewpoints.
It's interesting because the Berkeley free speech movement is often celebrated as this victory for free speech.
Mhm.
But Shapiro seems to see it as the beginning of a slippery slope.
He does. He believes that the movement, while initially focused on expanding free speech rights, ultimately paved the way for a culture of intolerance on campuses where certain viewpoints are just deemed unacceptable and are actively silenced.
Okay. I see how he's connecting the dots here. But what evidence does he offer for this claim that universities have become echo chambers for left-wing ideology?
Well, for one, he points to the dramatic overrepresentation of liberal viewpoints in academia. He cites studies showing that liberal professors outnumber conservative professors by a significant margin, nearly 12 to 1 in some fields.
Wow, that is a stark imbalance. It does raise questions about whether conservative students and faculty feel comfortable expressing their views in that kind of environment.
Right. And he argues that this imbalance creates a chilling effect on campus, where conservative students often self-censor for fear of being ostracized or even panelized for their beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. If you feel like you're in the minority, you might hesitate to express a viewpoint that you think could get you in trouble.
Exactly. He also introduces this interesting concept he calls renormalization to explain how small groups of activists can effectively reshape the culture of, an entire university.
Renormalization. That sounds like a scientific term. How does he apply that to the university setting?
He uses a pretty simple analogy to illustrate this. Imagine a family where the daughter insists on only eating, organic food. To avoid the hassle of cooking separate meals, the parents eventually give in, and they start cooking only organic for everyone. Shapiro argues that this same dynamic plays out in universities.
So he's saying that small vocal groups of activists, through sheer persistence and strategic pressure, can force their agenda on the larger, less engaged majority.
Exactly. And he believes that this renormalization process has led to a situation where even the hard sciences aren't immune to this ideological influence.
Really, even the hard science. I always thought those fields were supposed to be, more objective, driven by data and evidence, not political agendas.
Yeah, I mean, that's the traditional view, but Shapiro argues that this is no longer the case. He points to examples of how scientific research and funding are increasingly being directed toward projects that align with, specific political agendas, even when those agendas contradict scientific evidence.
That's a pretty disturbing thought. I mean, if even the hard sciences are susceptible to political manipulation, then where does that leave us?
That's a question Shapiro grapples with throughout the book.
So he's painted a rather bleak picture of universities as echo chambers where dissenting voices are silenced and academic freedom is under threat. What's the next institution on his hit list?
That would be the media.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Ben Shapiro's The Authoritarian Moment.
Right. When we left off, we were just starting to explore Shapiro's critique of the media.
Yeah, and I imagine you can already guess where he's going with this one. He argues that despite claims of objectivity, the media, particularly mainstream outlets, leans heavily to the left.
Well, that's a pretty common critique these days, especially from conservatives. What makes Shapiro's take on media bias different or more compelling, do you think?
So he doesn't just state that the media is biased. He tries to back up that claim by providing specific examples of what he sees as this bias in action. One of the main issues he takes aim at is what he calls the media's tendency to rush to judgment, often getting the facts wrong, especially in cases involving race or social justice.
Can you give me like a specific example of what he's talking about?
Sure. So he brings up the incident involving students from Covington Catholic High School. That happened a few years ago. Remember that one?
Yeah, I vaguely remember it. It involved a confrontation between a group of high school boys and a Native American activist at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C.
Exactly. And, initially, the media coverage largely portrayed the students as, as the aggressors, accusing them of mocking and harassing this Native American man.
But then, as more footage emerged, a more nuanced picture of the event began to surface, right? One that didn't necessarily fit the initial narrative.
Exactly. So Shapiro uses this incident as an example of how the media, in their rush to judgment, often latches onto narratives that fit their preconceived notions, even if those narratives turn out to be incomplete or inaccurate.
So he's arguing that the media's desire to be first to break a story sometimes trumps their responsibility to get the story right.
Right. And in doing so, they can end up perpetuating harmful stereotypes and unfairly damaging people's reputations. He also criticizes the media's handling of stories like the Hunter Biden laptop controversy.
Oh, right. That was a story that broke just before the 2020 presidential election. I remember it was quite controversial.
Yeah. So the story involved a laptop that allegedly belonged to Hunter Biden, who is the son of then presidential candidate Joe Biden. And the contents of this laptop suggested potential conflicts of interest, maybe even some illegal activity.
And Shapiro's contention is that the media downplayed or even dismissed the story because it could have potentially hurt Joe Biden's chances of winning the election.
That's right. Shapiro argues that the media's reluctance to cover the story aggressively or even acknowledge its potential significance was a clear example of their bias in favor of liberal causes and candidates.
Shapiro also suggests that the media is increasingly working with social media companies to actively censor conservative viewpoints.
Yes. He's particularly critical of what he sees as a growing trend of media outlets pressuring social media companies like Facebook and Twitter to suppress or even ban content that they deem harmful or misleading, even if that content expresses, legitimate conservative viewpoints.
So in Shapiro's view, the media isn't just shaping public opinion through their own reporting, but they're also trying to control the flow of information on social media platforms, essentially creating an echo chamber where only left-leaning viewpoints are allowed to circulate.
It's how he sees it, yeah.
Okay, so we've covered universities and the media. Let's move on to the next target on Shapiro's list of institutions that he believes have been weaponized by the authoritarian left. Corporations. This should be interesting.
It is. This is where his arguments get, I think, really interesting and maybe even a little bit controversial, even for some conservatives.
Oh, so?
Well, so Shapiro contends that corporations, in their eagerness to appear woke, and socially progressive, have actually caved to pressure from left-leaning activists and adopted policies that are, he says they're harmful to their employees and ultimately bad for business.
So he's saying that these companies are so afraid of being labeled racist or insensitive that they're willing to embrace policies that might actually be counterproductive.
Right. One of his big criticisms is directed at the kind of diversity training programs that many corporations have implemented in recent years.
Yeah, those are programs designed to make workplaces more inclusive and, sensitive to the needs of diverse employees.
Right. That's the idea in theory. But Shapiro believes that many of these programs have become vehicles for pushing a particular ideological agenda rather than promoting, genuine understanding and respect among employees.
So he sees them as more like indoctrination rather than education.
Yes. And he worries that they're creating a climate of fear and suspicion in the workplace where people are constantly worried about saying or doing the wrong thing.
He's also critical of what he calls stakeholder capitalism, isn't he? Can you unpack that term for me?
Sure. So stakeholder capitalism is the idea that corporations have a responsibility not just to their shareholders, those are the people who own stock in the company, but also to a broader range of stakeholders, including their employees, their customers, and even the community at large.
So it's basically the idea that companies should consider the impact of their actions on a wider group of people, not just on their own bottom line.
Yeah. Right. And it sounds good in theory, right? I mean, who wouldn't want companies to be more socially responsible and ethical in their business practices?
Yeah, exactly. What's Shapiro's problem with this model?
His concern is that stakeholder capitalism gives corporate leaders a lot of unchecked power to make decisions that might not actually be in the best interests of their employees or their shareholders.
So he sees it as a way for corporate elites to kind of impose their own values and priorities on everyone else under this guise of social responsibility.
Precisely. He believes that that many of the decisions that corporations make in the name of stakeholder capitalism are actually driven by a desire to appease left-leaning activists and avoid bad press, rather than a genuine commitment to to social good.
Okay, so we've covered universities, the media, and corporations. That leaves two more institutions on Shapiro's list: Hollywood and social media. Let's move on to Hollywood next. Lights, camera, authoritarianism.
Exactly. Shapiro argues that Hollywood has become a hotbed of political correctness, where conservative viewpoints are actively excluded, and anyone who dares to deviate from the prevailing liberal orthodoxy risks being ostracized, blacklisted.
So he's saying that Hollywood is basically a one-party town where conservatives need not apply.
Pretty much, yeah. He points to the fact that the vast majority of actors, writers, directors, and producers in Hollywood are liberal, and he believes that this creates a culture where conservative voices are silenced and conservative viewpoints are rarely, if ever, represented on screen.
He also highlights the case of Gina Carano, the actress who was fired from the Disney Plus series The Mandalorian for expressing some, controversial views on social media.
Yes. He uses her case as a prime example of what he sees as Hollywood's intolerance of conservative viewpoints.
It's interesting, though, because Shapiro didn't just sit back and criticize Hollywood's treatment of Carano. He actually, offered her a film deal with the Daily Wire.
He did, yeah. It's almost as if he's trying to put his money where his mouth is, so to speak. He's trying to build an alternative Hollywood, one that's more welcoming to conservative voices and perspectives.
That's a pretty intriguing approach. It's kind of like a David versus Goliath situation, isn't it? Taking on the Hollywood establishment with a relatively small independent media company.
It certainly is, but Shapiro seems to believe that it's a fight worth having. He sees it as a way to push back against what he perceives as the authoritarian grip of the left on the entertainment industry.
Okay. So that's Hollywood. Let's wrap up our discussion of Shapiro's book by exploring his take on the last institution on his list, social media.
Right. This is where Shapiro's concerns about mob rule and cancel culture really come to the forefront.
Right. So last we left off, we were talking about how Shapiro views social media. He's been a pretty vocal critic of what he calls cancel culture. Right?
He has, and he really sees social media as both a symptom and a catalyst for this phenomenon. He thinks social media has given a megaphone to what he calls outrage mobs, and has empowered them to target and silence individuals who express viewpoints that run counter to what he sees as the prevailing left-wing orthodoxy.
So he's basically saying that social media has weaponized outrage and made it much easier to publicly shame and silence people for expressing views that the mob doesn't like.
Yeah, that's his argument. He thinks social media platforms have created this climate of fear where people are afraid to express their true beliefs, even on seemingly harmless topics, because they're worried about being attacked by an online mob.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a concern. Nobody wants to be the target of a social media pylon.
Oh, he definitely lays a lot of blame at the feet of the social media companies. He's really critical of their content moderation policies, which he believes are often biased against conservative viewpoints. He points to several high-profile cases where conservative voices have been suspended or banned from platforms like Twitter and Facebook for expressing views that, while maybe controversial, don't necessarily violate any terms of service.
Right, and he also brings up the example of how social media companies handled the story about Hunter Biden's laptop, the one we were talking about earlier.
Yes, he sees that as a prime example of, how social media companies can collude with the media, or at least what he sees as the left-leaning media, to suppress information that they deem harmful or inconvenient, even if that information is true.
Right, if I remember correctly, Twitter initially blocked users from sharing links to the New York Post story about the laptop, and Facebook limited its distribution on its platform.
Exactly, and Shapiro argues that those actions were taken not because the story was demonstrably false, but because it had the potential to damage Joe Biden's candidacy.
So in his view, these social media companies are essentially picking and choosing which narratives they want to promote and which ones they want to suppress, based on their own ideological biases.
That's right. And he sees this as a really dangerous trend that's eroding trust in these platforms and undermining the free flow of information that's essential for a healthy democracy.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've really unpacked Shapiro's critiques of these various institutions, universities, the media, corporations, Hollywood, and social media. It's a pretty bleak picture, to be honest. Does he offer any solutions, or is he just sounding the alarm?
Well, he's definitely sounding the alarm, but he also provides a call to action. He doesn't want conservatives to simply sit back and accept what he sees as the left's growing dominance in these institutions. He urges them to actively resist, to fight back against what he sees as this tide of authoritarianism sweeping across America.
Okay, so what does he suggest they do? Does he have any specific strategies for combating this perceived threat?
He offers, a multi-pronged approach. First, he calls for individual action and resistance. He wants conservatives to be more vocal in defending their values and challenging the prevailing orthodoxy in their own spheres of influence.
Yeah.
In their workplaces, their communities, and online. He urges them not to self-censor or back down from difficult conversations.
So essentially he's saying, don't be afraid to speak your mind, even if your views aren't popular.
Right, exactly. He believes that silence is a form of consent, and that if conservatives don't actively push back against what he sees as the authoritarian left, they're essentially giving them a free pass to reshape society in their image.
But it's not just about individuals speaking out, right? He also advocates for more systemic changes.
He does, yeah. He encourages conservatives to support businesses and media outlets that align with their values and to boycott those that don't. He suggests that conservatives use their economic power to push back against what he sees as the left's cultural dominance.
So it's a kind of vote with your wallet approach.
Exactly. He also encourages people to, run for office, donate to conservative candidates, and get involved in local politics. He believes that conservatives need to reclaim their voice in the political arena if they want to have a lasting impact.
And he even points to his own efforts to create alternative media platforms like the Daily Wire as a model for how conservatives can build institutions that reflect their values and provide a space for their voices to be heard.
He does. He sees these kinds of initiatives as essential for combating what he perceives as the left's control over the mainstream media and cultural institutions.
So it's not just about fighting back against individual instances of what he sees as bias or censorship. It's about creating a whole new ecosystem, a parallel society almost, where conservative voices can thrive.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, he's essentially calling for a cultural counter-revolution.
It's a pretty ambitious vision. Do you think it's realistic? Can conservatives really build a a sustainable alternative to the existing cultural and political power structures?
Well, that's a question that Shapiro's book has struck a nerve. It's resonated with a large segment of the population, particularly those who feel like their values are under attack and their voices are being silenced.
The book has definitely sparked a lot of debate and discussion, which I think is a good thing. Whether you agree with Shapiro's conclusions or not, I think it's important to engage with his ideas and to think critically about the challenges that are facing American democracy.
I agree. And as we wrap up our deep dive into the authoritarian moment, I think it's worth noting that the book has been both praised and criticized.
What are some of the main criticisms that you've seen?
Well, some critics argue that that Shapiro is overstating the threat from the left, and that he's actually contributing to the very polarization and division that he claims to be fighting against. They accuse him of cherry picking evidence to support his arguments and ignoring counterexamples that don't fit his narrative.
Right, and others have pointed out that Shapiro himself has been a target of this cancel culture, so his perspective on the issue might be influenced by his own personal experiences.
That's true. It's always important to consider the author's background and potential biases when you're evaluating their work.
But I think even those who disagree with Shapiro's conclusions acknowledge that he's raising important questions about the state of free speech and open debate in America today.
Absolutely, and these are questions that we as a society need to grapple with honestly and thoughtfully. We need to have open and respectful conversations about how to balance these competing values, how to protect individual freedoms while also promoting inclusivity and tolerance, and how to ensure that our institutions are truly serving the interests of all Americans.
So where do we go from here? What are your final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, if you're interested in exploring these issues further, I encourage you to read Ben Shapiro's book, The Authoritarian Moment: How the Left Weaponized America's Institutions Against Dissent. It's a thought-provoking read, even if you don't agree with everything he says.
Yeah, you can find it wherever books are sold. And as always, we encourage you to share your own thoughts and perspectives with us. We'd love to hear what resonated with you and what questions this book raised for you.
Understanding the complexities of our time is a journey we take together. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.